When public opinion can convince your own children and your own grandparents that you did something like that, that's kind of hard to.
For almost 30 years, Glen Violi says, there were people who looked at him and wondered whether he knew more than he was saying about the disappearance of his 7-year-old daughter. Some of that suspicion reached his own family. It followed him into workplaces, into relationships, into the years after Morgan was gone. But there is one fact that completely changes the way this case looks today. Before Morgan Violi's body was even found, the man who would eventually plead guilty to kidnapping and killing her was already back in custody. And just 8 days before Morgan disappeared, he had escaped from jail. For the second time. For decades, these seemed to be two completely separate stories. One was the story Bowling Green knew, a little girl taken in broad daylight, a stolen maroon van, a grieving family, and an investigation that could not identify the man witnesses had seen. The other story moved through Alabama, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and back south. An armed robber, 2 escapes from custody, another encounter involving a 7-year-old child, a stolen vehicle, and a fugitive trying to stay ahead of police. In 1996, those stories did not have a name connecting them. 30 years later, a preserved hair did. And to understand why that one piece of evidence mattered so much, we have to go back to what investigators actually knew, and what they only thought they knew, when Morgan disappeared. It was July 24, 1996. Morgan Jade Violi was 7 years old and living at the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Family members later remembered a friendly, intelligent little girl whose smile stood out to them. In a 2016 interview, her family made one thing clear. They did not want Morgan remembered simply as the child at the center of a famous cold case. She had been their sister, their daughter, a real person whose absence altered the family that remained. Just after noon that day, Morgan was outside with other children near the wooded edge of the apartment property. According to the federal complaint filed 30 years later, Morgan was with a 6-year-old friend when a man driving a maroon Chevrolet van entered the area. The man got out, and Morgan was not initially the child he grabbed. He first tried to seize her 6-year-old friend. She managed to escape his grasp. He then grabbed Morgan. That detail matters. Because this was not a disappearance discovered hours later, with no witnesses and no obvious point of departure. There was another child who had encountered the man. There was an adult eyewitness. There was a vehicle. There was even part of its license plate. The adult witness described a burgundy Chevrolet van and remembered blue characters on its plate, including the letters M and N. She described the abductor as a thin, tanned white man in his 20s, with brown, shoulder-length hair, wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. A police artist created a sketch from the witness information. Morgan's oldest sister, Heather, also saw part of what was unfolding. Years later, she described hearing a scream and seeing the man and the van before fully understanding what had happened.
I heard a scream. I came around. He was just sitting in the van.
And then the vehicle was gone. Morgan was gone with it. That should have given investigators an enormous advantage. Instead, it gave them the beginning of an enormous puzzle. Because while police were trying to identify the stranger in the van, another possibility was beginning to attract attention much closer to Morgan. Her father. Glen and Morgan's mother, Stacy, were in the middle of a divorce. According to later reporting, a custody proceeding had taken place that day. Glen's absence from that hearing became one of the circumstances scrutinized after Morgan vanished. Glen later said there had been a misunderstanding about whether he needed to appear. The FBI investigated him as a possible suspect. Glen has also said he failed 5 of 6 polygraph examinations. And this is where the story requires an important distinction. It is easy 30 years later to say police should never have looked at Morgan's father. That would be hindsight. In a child disappearance, investigators examine relatives, custody disputes, recent conflicts, and the movements of people close to the child. The The question is not whether Glen should have been questioned. The question is what happened. After the available evidence began pointing somewhere else, there was an eyewitness describing a stranger. There was a second child whom that stranger had reportedly tried to grab first. And there was a vehicle police could potentially trace. Yet the uncertainty surrounding Glen quickly escaped the boundaries of an investigation and became something much harder to reverse: a public story. In 2016, 20 years after Morgan vanished, Glen told WKO that there were still people who believed he had been involved. He described trouble finding work and said members of his own extended family had confronted him. That same report said he had been cleared of wrongdoing. More recent reporting states that his name was removed from investigators' suspect list nearly 2 years after the kidnapping, and that the FBI never formally announced him, or anyone else, as an official suspect. But by then, the distinction between investigated and guilty in the court of public opinion mattered very little to the person living underneath it. Meanwhile, outside Bowling Green, police found something far more concrete: the van. On July 26, 2 days after Morgan was abducted, law enforcement located the maroon Chevrolet at a truck stop in Williamson County, Tennessee, and it was not registered to the man who had taken Morgan. It had been stolen. The vehicle had disappeared from behind a residence in Dayton, Ohio, on July 23rd, the day before the abduction. The actual Ohio plate was NM80UZ. Compare that with what the witness had remembered under the pressure of watching a child being taken: a burgundy Chevrolet van with blue plate characters including M and N. It was an imperfect memory, but it was remarkably close to the real vehicle investigators eventually recovered. Police processed the van for evidence, but recovering the likely vehicle and identifying the person who had driven it were two very different problems. Because a stolen vehicle breaks one of the easiest investigative links. Registration leads to an owner. It does not necessarily lead to a thief. The man in the witness sketch still had no name. And Morgan was still missing. Then, on October 20, nearly 3 months after the abduction, her remains were found in woods near White House, Tennessee. A family that had spent months hoping for one answer received the answer nobody wanted. But finding Morgan did not identify the man who had taken her. 5 months later, forensic testing strengthened the connection to the recovered Chevrolet. On March 5, 1997, the FBI laboratory reported that a fiber found with Morgan's hair was consistent with fiber from the seat cushion of the stolen 1978 maroon Chevrolet van. That language matters. Consistent with is not the same thing as this fiber could only have come from this one van. FBI forensic guidance explains that fiber comparisons generally involve class characteristics. Fibers can be consistent with a source without being uniquely individualized to that single object. So the 1997 finding was important. It supported the proposition that investigators had the right vehicle. What it did not do was tell them who had been behind the wheel. That distinction is the first major key to understanding why this case remained open. Investigators could increasingly reconstruct what had happened. They still could not identify who had done it. And sitting among the material collected from the Chevrolet was evidence whose significance would change dramatically with time. Hairs had been recovered from vacuum sweepings taken from the front and rear floorboards of the van. They were preserved, mounted on glass microscope slides, and kept with the case. If you value documentaries that go back into familiar cases and ask what the evidence could actually prove at each stage, not simply what we know now, that is exactly what we do here on Cold Case Stories. Because in Morgan's case, the difference between evidence that connected a vehicle and evidence that could eventually identify a person explains almost 30 years. During those years, Morgan's case never completely disappeared. It received national attention. Later reporting says it was featured twice on America's Most Wanted. And at one point there was a $20,000 reward. Locally, Morgan's family continued talking about her. Her sister Nikki later used Morgan's memory to support a Bowling Green charity effort. And investigators continued returning to the case. In 2016, FBI Special Agent Dick Glen, who had been assigned to it in 1996, was still publicly discussing the investigation nearly 20 years later. What they still lacked was a name. And that becomes extraordinary when we reconstruct what the man responsible had actually been doing in the months surrounding Morgan's abduction. Robert Scott Froberg's path to Bowling Green did not begin in Kentucky. It began years earlier in Alabama. According to the federal complaint, Froberg committed an armed robbery in Montgomery in December 1988 and later received a lengthy prison sentence. In February 1995, prison officials found him in possession of 2 nude photographs of minor girls. Then, on April 3, 1996, less than 4 months before Morgan disappeared, Froberg escaped from an Alabama prison work detail. Authorities say he robbed an elderly woman, stole her Oldsmobile, and eventually made his way north to Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania. There, on May 20th, something happened that becomes difficult to ignore once you know what came next. According to the federal affidavit, Froberg was hiding in a children's treehouse near a residential area when a 7-year-old boy approached. Froberg encouraged the boy to climb into the treehouse and offered to buy him candy. The boy instead went home and told his mother. She investigated, found Froberg where her son said he would be, and called police. Froberg ran. He was caught. He was taken to the Northumberland County Jail. At this point, Morgan Violi was alive in Kentucky. Froberg was in custody in Pennsylvania. And had that remained true, their lives might never have intersected. But on July 16th, Froberg escaped again. The federal complaint describes him climbing a rain spout to the jail roof, using a cable to get down, and stealing a prison employee's bicycle as he fled. This was his second escape in a little over 3 months. 7 days later, on July 23rd, a maroon Chevrolet van was stolen in Dayton, Ohio. The location was roughly half a mile from the home where Froberg's parents were living. The next day, that same van was in Bowling Green. And Robert Froberg was behind the wheel. That last sentence is something investigators could not have said in 1996. They had the stolen van. They had the witness sketch. They had descriptions. Later, they would have the fiber. But Robert Froberg was not the name those clues produced. In fact, prosecutors said in 2026 that Froberg did not become a suspect in Morgan's case until the later DNA evidence associated him with the van. That is one of the most important facts in this entire story, because it means we should resist the temptation to describe 1996 as a case where police had Froberg and missed him. The public record supports something more complicated. Different law enforcement agencies had records of a fugitive named Robert Froberg. Bowling Green investigators had evidence connected to an unidentified man driving a stolen Chevrolet. What they did not have was a verified bridge showing those men were the same person. Today, when we can place every event on one timeline, the connection appears obvious. April, escape. May, arrest after the treehouse encounter. July 16, second escape. July 23, van stolen near his parents. July 24th, Morgan abducted in that van. August 21, Froberg arrested again in Pennsylvania. But that timeline exists because investigators were eventually given his name and could work backward through records across multiple states. In 1996, they were working in the opposite direction. They had the crime. They had to discover the person. And the vehicle itself had been stolen by someone they could not identify. Froberg was arrested in Pennsylvania on August 21, 1996. That date deserves to sit on screen for a moment. August 21, 1996. Morgan had been missing for less than 1 month. Her remains would not be discovered until October 20. The man responsible was therefore back in custody before Morgan was even found. Bowling Green did not know it. And this creates one of the cruelest contradictions in the case. For years, people in Bowling Green feared Morgan's killer might still be somewhere outside the justice system. At the same time, Glen Violi lived with people wondering whether the killer might have been Morgan's own father. The truth appears to have been neither. The man who had taken Morgan was already imprisoned for other crimes. His name simply had not been connected to hers. For Glen, formal investigative status did not erase what had already taken hold. In the 2016 WBCO report, 2 of his daughters said they did not believe their father could have harmed Morgan. 10 years later, Glen described years in which public suspicion had nevertheless damaged family relationships, and said that after the 2026 breakthrough, he reunited with relatives and received apologies from his daughters. Those accounts capture something that an arrest record never could. A person can be removed from a suspect list. A rumor does not have a case management system. There is no official form that makes everyone who heard an accusation hear the correction. And then, decades after the hairs were collected from the Chevrolet, the science available to investigators had changed. The federal complaint does not tell us the precise date on which the decisive retesting was ordered. It does not identify every laboratory technique used. And it would be misleading to invent a clean story in which investigators simply waited 30 years for one particular machine to be invented. What the complaint does say is this: advances in DNA processing led investigators to request additional laboratory testing on hairs recovered from the van's floorboards. Those hairs had been preserved on glass microscope slides. The FBI extracted a DNA profile from one of them. That profile was searched through CODIS, and CODIS returned an association with Robert Scott Froberg. That is the moment this investigation changed direction. Not because investigators suddenly discovered the van. They had possessed the van evidence since 1996. Not because they suddenly learned Morgan had been inside it. The fiber evidence had strengthened that connection in 1997. What changed was identity. The evidence finally supplied a name: Robert Scott Froberg. Only then, according to the federal affidavit, did the FBI and Bowling Green Police Department begin investigating Froberg in connection with Morgan. And once they had his name, the old records began to rearrange themselves into a route. Investigators learned about the Alabama armed robbery, the first escape, the arrest in Pennsylvania, the second escape, the stolen van in Dayton, and they uncovered another connection that helped explain why Froberg had been traveling south. He had an association with a former Alabama Department of Corrections nurse who lived in Huntsville. Interviews with former inmates gave investigators reason to believe Huntsville had been his intended destination. Bowling Green sits along Interstate 65 on that southbound route. Suddenly, the location that had looked random in 1996 had context. Froberg had not been identified as a Bowling Green resident. There was no publicly established long-term connection between him and Morgan's family. According to his later admission, he was passing through. He told investigators that he exited Interstate 65 in Bowling Green because he wanted to obtain marijuana. He went to the Colony Apartments, and there he saw Morgan. The federal plea announcement adds another fact that had been sitting in the original investigation all along. Before grabbing Morgan, Froberg attempted to abduct her 7-year-old friend. She escaped. Then he took Morgan. That matters when we return to the question viewers still ask about Glen. Why didn't the witnesses simply recognize Morgan's own father if he had been the man at the apartment complex? They didn't identify Glen as the abductor. The adult witness described a stranger and helped produce a sketch. The federal evidence now establishes that the man in the stolen van was Froberg. Yet suspicion toward Glen grew from an entirely different set of circumstances surrounding the family and custody proceedings. 2 different narratives were forming at the same time. Only one was connected to the van. On February 24, 2026, A Bowling Green detective and FBI investigators brought Froberg to the FBI office in Montgomery, Alabama. He was advised of his Miranda rights. He waived them, and he spoke. According to the federal complaint, Froberg acknowledged the Pennsylvania treehouse encounter and his escape from Northumberland County Jail. He admitted traveling through Bowling Green on his way toward Huntsville. He admitted stealing the Chevrolet van in Dayton. And he admitted taking Morgan. Investigators no longer had merely a DNA association and a reconstructed interstate route. They had an admission. Froberg said he drove south from Bowling Green with Morgan and stopped after exiting Interstate 65 at White House, Tennessee, near a barn. He admitted killing Morgan there and leaving her body in the woods. The federal affidavit also says he disposed of Morgan's clothing because he was concerned about DNA evidence, cleaned the van, abandoned it at the truck stop, and continued to Huntsville. He remained there for roughly a week before eventually returning to Pennsylvania, where he was arrested on August 21, 1996. There is an awful irony in that detail. The evidence Froberg said he feared in 1996 did not disappear simply because he tried to clean the vehicle. Investigators preserved what remained, and almost 30 years later, biological material recovered from that vehicle helped identify him. 2 days after the interview, on February 26, 2026, federal authorities filed a criminal complaint charging Froberg with kidnapping, resulting in death. The following day, officials announced the breakthrough in Bowling Green. For the first time, Morgan's family was being given an answer, supported not by rumor or suspicion, but by forensic evidence, a reconstructed timeline, and Froberg's own admissions. For Glen, that announcement meant something else as well. He said the years of public suspicion had affected his employment, his connection to family, and the way people saw him. After the announcement, he told WPCO that family members had apologized and that he was willing to forgive people who had doubted him. But even here, accuracy matters. The discovery of Froberg does not. Mean police formally considered Glen their primary suspect for 30 uninterrupted years. The available reporting does not support that. What it supports is in some ways more revealing. Glen was investigated. He was later removed from the suspect list. Yet the suspicion outlived that investigative status. That is why the phrase, 30 years wrong, belongs more to the story of public perception than to a claim that detectives knowingly spent 30 years pursuing the wrong man. The criminal case against Froberg continued through 2026. He initially entered a not guilty plea at his April arraignment. Then, on July 22nd, that changed. Robert Scott Froberg pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of kidnapping resulting in death. The Justice Department announced that he had agreed to a life sentence. His formal sentencing is scheduled for November 2, 2026, and the Justice Department says that if the court accepts the plea agreement, Froberg will receive life imprisonment with no federal parole. So as of now, one important distinction remains: the mystery of who kidnapped Morgan Violi has been resolved by evidence, admission, and guilty plea. The sentencing process is not yet complete, but the most revealing part of the case may be what happened before anyone knew Froberg's name. Investigators were not working with nothing. They had a witness. They had a description. They had a sketch. They had a stolen van. They had a fiber that helped connect Morgan to that vehicle. And they had hairs preserved from the floor. What they lacked was the thing every one of those clues needed in order to become a path rather than a collection of facts: an identity. Once a single hair produced that identity, investigators could travel backward through 30 years. A prison record in Alabama, an escape, a stolen automobile, a treehouse in Pennsylvania, another arrest, another escape, a bicycle, a family home in Dayton, a Chevrolet stolen half a mile away, Interstate 65, Bowling Green, White House, Huntsville, Pennsylvania, and an arrest on August 21, 1996. Suddenly, Events that had existed as pieces of separate investigations became one continuous route. That is why this case should not simply be remembered as another story in which DNA solved a cold case. DNA did something more specific. It connected a man to evidence that investigators had preserved. His name allowed them to reconstruct his movements. That reconstruction placed a twice-escaped prisoner in the stolen van witnesses had described, and his own admissions filled in the remaining route. The technology did not rewrite 1996. It finally gave investigators the name they needed to understand it. And while they waited for that name, another name had occupied far too much of the story: Glen Violi. A father whose personal circumstances made him understandable to investigate. A man later removed from suspicion. But also a man who says the public judgment did not disappear when investigators moved on. That is one of the lasting warnings buried inside this case. Investigations can change. Evidence can change. Technology can change. But public certainty is often much slower to admit that it was wrong. Morgan's family spent 30 years without the answer they needed. Investigators spent 30 years without the name that connected their evidence. And Glen spent much of those same 30 years living with a different kind of unanswered question: whether people would ever believe that he had nothing to do with what happened to his daughter. In 2026, a preserved hair helped answer both. Robert Scott Froberg had escaped custody twice. He had passed through Bowling Green as a fugitive. He had stolen the van investigators recovered. And before Morgan Violi's remains were found, he was already back behind bars. The truth was not living secretly in Bowling Green. It was sitting in evidence, and sitting in prison, without anyone knowing that the two belonged to the same story. If you want more cold case stories documentaries that revisit cases like this and investigate the evidence, decisions, and unanswered questions that shorter versions leave behind, subscribe. Because sometimes solving a cold case does more than reveal who committed the crime. Sometimes it reveals how long everyone had been looking at the wrong story.